The morning sun peeked through the bathroom window as 16-year-old Zara stood in front of the mirror, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and nervousness. After 6 long years of chemical straightening, weekly salon visits, and hiding her true self, she had finally made the decision. Her natural hair, now styled in a beautiful afro, framed her face perfectly. She gently touched the curls, remembering how her grandmother had stayed up late last night, helping her prepare for this moment. "You look beautiful, honey," her mom called from the doorway, coffee mug in hand. There was pride in her voice, but also a hint of worry, the kind that only black mothers know too well. "Are you sure about today?" Zara nodded, adjusting her navy blue sweater over her crisp white shirt. She had deliberately chosen this outfit to look extra professional, knowing that first impressions mattered more for some people than others. "Unsure, Mom. I'm done pretending." The drive to Riverside High School felt different that morning. Zara noticed little things she usually missed: the crossing guard's friendly wave, the freshman students huddled in their usual spots, the morning light hitting the school's brick walls. Maybe it was because she was sitting taller today, feeling more like herself than she had in years. Her best friend Nisha spotted her first in the parking lot. "Oh my gosh, you actually did it," she squealed, running over to hug Zara. "You look amazing." A few other students turned to look, some smiling, others whispering. Zara felt her confidence grow with each step toward the school entrance. Everything changed when she reached her locker. The familiar click-clack of heels against linoleum made several students straighten their postures instinctively. Principal Whitmore had that effect on people. She was known for her strict enforcement of school rules, particularly the dress code. "Miss Thompson," the principal's voice cut through the morning chatter like ice. "My office. Now." Zara's heart sank, but she kept her head high as she followed Principal Whitmore down the hallway. She could feel dozens of eyes on her back, the whispers already starting. Inside the office, the principal didn't even offer her a seat. "Your hair is in violation of our dress code," Principal Whitmore stated, her thin lips pressed into an even thinner line. "It's distracting and unprofessional. This isn't appropriate for our learning environment." Zara took a deep breath, just like her mother had taught her. "Ma'am, I've read the dress code carefully. There's nothing in it that prohibits natural hair." "I made sure of that." The principal's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me, young lady. The code clearly states that hair must be neat and appropriate. This is neither." "My hair is neat," Zara responded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And I don't understand what's inappropriate about its natural texture." What happened next would later be recounted dozens of times by Zara to reporters, lawyers, and eventually to a packed school board meeting. Principal Whitmore's face had flushed red, her voice rising as she lectured about standards and proper appearance. When Zara tried to explain that her hair was indeed its natural state, the principal cut her off. 1 week suspension for insubordination and dress code violation, she snapped, already writing up the slip. "Perhaps this will give you time to reconsider your choices and return to a more appropriate hairstyle." Zara stood there, suspension slip in hand, feeling as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She thought about all the times she'd burned her scalp with chemicals, all the swimming classes she'd skipped to maintain her straight hair, all the parts of herself she'd hidden to fit someone else's definition of appropriate. As she walked out of the office, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Misha. "What happened?" "Everyone's talking about it." Zara looked at her reflection in the trophy case glass as she passed by. Her afro was still perfect, still beautiful, still her. She typed back, "They suspended me, but this isn't over." She didn't know it then, but she was right. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As she pushed open the heavy school doors and stepped into the morning sun, she had no idea that her stand would uncover decades of discrimination, expose a principal's dark past, and spark a movement that would change Riverside High forever. But for now, she just needed to figure out how to tell her parents that their daughter had been suspended for simply being herself. Zara's mom nearly dropped her coffee mug when she saw her daughter walking through the front door at 9:30 in the morning. One look at the paper in Zara's trembling hands told her everything she needed to know. She'd been a civil rights attorney long enough to recognize that particular shade of yellow paper, a suspension notice. "They did what?" her mother whispered, reading the slip. The kitchen fell silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Zara watched her mother's face change as she read each line, her expression shifting from shock to anger to a determination that Zara knew all too well. "Call your father," her mom said, already reaching for her own phone. "He needs to hear about this." Zara's father arrived home 20 minutes later, still wearing his press badge from the local newspaper where he worked as an investigative journalist. His usual warm smile was replaced with a concerned frown as he listened to Zara recount every detail of her interaction with Principal Whitmore. "And she didn't cite any specific dress code violation?" he asked, taking notes in the small notebook he always carried. Old-school journalist habits died hard. "No," Zara replied, fidgeting with her sleeve. "She just kept saying it wasn't appropriate and professional." "But Dad, I checked the code 3 times before deciding to wear my hair natural. There's nothing in there about natural hair being against the rules." Her father nodded, his journalist instincts already kicking in. "I'm going to look into this. Something doesn't add up." He turned to his wife. "Remember that story from a few years back? The one about disproportionate suspension rates?" Zara's mother was already pulling up files on her laptop. As a civil rights attorney, she'd handled dozens of discrimination cases, but this one hit differently. This was her daughter. "I'm pulling up the school's disciplinary records now," she said, typing quickly. "They're public record. We just need to—" "Oh," she stopped, her eyes widening at something on the screen. "What is it?" Zara and her father asked simultaneously. "In the past 3 years, students of color have received suspensions at 4 times the rate of other students at Riverside High. And look at this, most of them were for dress code violations or insubordination." She made air quotes around the last word, her voice bitter. Zara's father leaned over to look at the screen, his reporter's notebook out again. "That's not all," he said, scrolling through something on his phone. "I'm seeing similar complaints from parents on social media. Lots of them. They just haven't been connected before." The doorbell rang, making them all jump. It was Nisha, holding Zara's backpack. "You left this in your locker," she said, stepping inside. "Everyone's talking about what happened. Look at this." She pulled out her phone to show them a series of social media posts. Students were sharing their own stories of dress code enforcement at Riverside High. A pattern was emerging, one that couldn't be ignored. "Dad," Zara asked, watching him type furiously on his laptop. "What are you doing?" "Following a lead," he replied, not looking up. Something about Principal Whitmore's name seemed familiar. "I covered education in my early reporting days, and here it is." He turned the screen so they could all see. The article was from 20 years ago in a different school district. The details were vague. Most of it had been settled out of court, but the similarities were striking. A pattern of discriminatory discipline, particularly targeting students of color. The principal's name? Margaret Whitmore. "She's done this before," Zara's mother said quietly, her attorney's mind already building a case. "And she's been getting away with it for decades." "Not anymore," her father replied, reaching for his phone. "I know some people who need to hear about this." Zara watched her parents spring into action, her mother making calls to civil rights organizations, her father reaching out to fellow journalists and researchers. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every student who'd ever been made to feel less than because of who they were. Her phone buzzed with another text from Nisha. "Check your social media." Zara opened the app to find hundreds of notifications. Someone had shared her story, and it was spreading fast. Students from other schools were reaching out, sharing similar experiences. Parents were expressing outrage. The local community was waking up to something that had been happening right under their noses. "Mom, Dad," she called out, showing them her phone. "I think this is getting bigger than we expected." Her mother paused her phone call to look at the screen. "Good," she said firmly. "Sometimes it takes one person standing up to show others they can stand too." As the afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen windows, Zara looked at her reflection in the microwave door. Her afro was still perfect, still beautiful, still her. But now it had become something more. A symbol of resistance against years of quiet discrimination. Her father's voice cut through her thoughts. "Just got off the phone with my editor," he announced. "They want to run the story. Front page." And I've got a meeting scheduled with the school board tomorrow morning, her mother added. They're not going to be able to sweep this under the rug. Zara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what was coming. She hadn't asked for this fight, but now that it was here, she was ready for it. She looked at her parents, at Nisha, at all the messages of support flooding her phone, and knew she wasn't in it alone. So she asked, "What's our next move?" By Wednesday morning, the story had spread like wildfire. Zara's father's article had hit the front page of the local newspaper, and within hours, it was being shared across social media platforms. The headline read, "Local students suspended for natural hair. A pattern of discrimination uncovered." The morning air was crisp as Zara stood at her bedroom window, watching a group of students gathering at the corner of her street. They carried handmade signs reading, "Our hair, our choice," and "End discrimination now." Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since yesterday. "Hey," Nisha's voice came through the phone. "Turn on the local news, Channel 5. Zara rushed downstairs to find her parents already watching. A reporter stood outside Riverside High, where dozens of students had gathered before the first bell. Many of them wore their hair natural, afros, braids, twists, and locks proudly displayed. Some non-black students had come wearing ribbons in their hair in solidarity. "This wasn't what I expected," Zara whispered, watching more students join the gathering. Her mother squeezed her shoulder. Sometimes people are just waiting for someone brave enough to speak up first. The crowd outside the school grew larger as parents began arriving with their own stories. A woman spoke to the news cameras about her daughter being sent home 3 years ago for wearing traditional African braids. Another parent shared how his son had been repeatedly cited for his dreadlocks until they finally transferred schools. "The school board meeting is being moved to the community center," Zara's father announced, hanging up his phone. "Too many people planning to attend. They're saying hundreds might show up." Around noon, Ms. Chen, who had taught at Riverside High for 30 years, appeared on the news. "I've watched this happen for too long," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Every year, I see bright students diminished by these unfair policies. Some transfer, some drop out, and we all lose when that happens. It's time for change." Social media exploded with support. #Riverside Hair Story started trending locally as more students and alumni shared their experiences. Local civil rights organizations announced they would attend the school board meeting. Even businesses got involved. The owner of a nearby hair salon offered free styling services to any student who had been disciplined for their natural hair. Zara sat at her kitchen table, overwhelmed by the response. Her phone lit up with a text from her grandmother. "Just saw the news. Your grandfather would have been so proud. He always said it takes one pebble to start an avalanche." The doorbell rang continuously that afternoon. Former students came to share their stories with Zara's father for his follow-up article. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same: students made to feel ashamed of their natural appearance, their culture, their identity. "You should hear this," her father called from the living room, where he was interviewing a former student who had graduated 5 years ago. "I kept my hair straightened all through high school," the young woman was saying. "The day after graduation, I cut it all off and grew it natural. But I still dream about those years sometimes, about feeling like I had to hide who I was to be accepted." As evening approached, Zara's mother returned from meeting with civil rights organizations. "The NAACP's involved now," she announced. "They're sending representatives to tomorrow's board meeting. And look at this." She showed them her laptop, where a petition demanding change at Riverside High had gathered over 50,000 signatures in less than 24 hours. Comments poured in from across the country, many sharing similar experiences at their own schools. "There's more," her father added, pulling up an email on his phone. 3 other local journalists reached out. They'd found similar patterns at other schools where Principal Whitmore worked before Riverside. This goes back decades. The house phone rang. Unusual, as most people called their cells. It was Mrs. Washington, who had retired from teaching at Riverside 10 years ago. "I had to call," she said, her voice carrying years of suppressed anger. "I watched that woman drive away so many bright spirits with her so-called standards. I kept records, you know. Names, dates, incidents. I always hoped someone would finally stand up to her. Later that night, as Zara helped her parents prepare for the next day's board meeting, she found herself staring at her reflection again. The girl who had walked into school just 2 days ago, nervous but proud, had no idea she was about to spark a movement. "You okay?" her mother asked, noticing her quiet moment. "Yeah," Zara replied. "I just keep thinking about all the students before me. How many of them felt alone when this happened to them?" Her mother hugged her tight. "That's why what's happening now is so important. You're making sure no one feels alone in this fight again." Outside, car horns honked in support of the students still gathered at the school. Social media continued to buzz with messages of solidarity. Local news stations announced they would broadcast tomorrow's board meeting live. "Get some rest," her father advised, reviewing his notes one last time. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day." As Zara headed upstairs to bed, her phone buzzed with one last message. It was from an unknown number. "I'm a student at East Side High. Because of your story, I'm wearing my hair natural to school tomorrow. Thank you for being brave." Zara smiled, feeling a mix of hope and determination. Tomorrow would indeed be a big day, not just for her, but for every student who had ever been made to feel less than perfect exactly as they were. The community center buzzed with activity hours before the school board meeting was set to begin. Zara's father had been up since dawn, working in his home office, following leads that had flooded his inbox overnight. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten as he pieced together a disturbing pattern spanning 2 decades. "You need to see this," he called out to his wife, who was reviewing legal documents at the kitchen table. He turned his laptop screen towards her, showing a series of newspaper clippings he'd found in digital archives. The articles were from different cities, different years, but they all shared a common thread: Principal Margaret Whitmore. In each location, similar patterns emerged: strict dress code enforcement that disproportionately targeted certain students, high suspension rates, and sudden transfers to new school districts. "Look at the dates," he pointed out. Every time questions started being raised, she'd move to a new district. The complaints would get settled quietly, and the cycle would start again. Zara's mother leaned in closer, her legal mind connecting the dots. "These settlements all have non-disclosure agreements. That's why no one caught the pattern before. Each district thought they were dealing with an isolated incident." The doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Washington, the retired teacher, clutching a worn leather briefcase. "I brought everything," she said, her hands slightly shaking as she opened the case. Inside were carefully organized folders, each labeled with dates going back years. "I kept track of every suspension, every dress code violation," she explained, spreading the documents across the kitchen table. "At first, I thought I was being paranoid. But the numbers don't lie." Zara watched as her parents and Mrs. Washington pored over the documents. Her father's reporter instincts were on high alert, while her mother's legal experience helped them understand the significance of each piece of evidence. Here, Mrs. Washington pointed to a particular file. This was from her first year at Riverside. "Notice how the suspension rates jumped immediately after she took over as principal?" The morning wore on as more pieces fell into place. Zara's phone buzzed with messages from other students and their parents, each sharing their own experiences. Her father's colleague from another newspaper called with information about Principal Whitmore's time at a school in a neighboring state. "It's like she had a playbook," Zara's father muttered, organizing his notes. "Start with dress code enforcement, then use insubordination charges when students or parents question the policies. The same pattern, over and over." Around noon, a former administrator from one of Principal Whitmore's previous schools arrived. He looked nervous but determined. "I've been following the story," he said. "I was there, at Westbrook High, when she implemented these same policies. I resigned in protest, but the district made me sign an NDA. But with all this coming out now..." He pulled out his own set of documents, emails, meeting minutes, and internal memos that painted a clear picture of deliberate discrimination. "She was careful with her words in official documents," he explained. "But these private communications tell a different story." Zara's mother studied the papers intently. "This is exactly what we needed. The pattern of behavior shows this isn't just about one incident or one school. It's systematic." As the afternoon approached, more reporters began arriving at their house. Local news vans parked along the street. Zora's father had been right. This was becoming much bigger than anyone expected. "There's something else," Mrs. Washington said quietly, pulling out one last folder. "Remember that student who dropped out 5 years ago? The one everyone said was just having trouble at home." She showed them the documentation she'd kept, a bright student whose grades had plummeted after repeated disciplinary actions for dress code violations. Zara felt a chill run down her spine. How many students had their education disrupted? How many dreams had been delayed or denied? Her own suspension didn't seem so bad in comparison. "We need to handle this carefully," her mother said, organizing the evidence. "This isn't just about winning a case. This is about making sure it never happens again." Her father nodded, already drafting his article. "The school board needs to see all of this. They need to understand that when they meet tonight, they're not just addressing one suspension, they're facing decades of systemic discrimination." As evening approached, Zara helped her parents pack up all the evidence for the board meeting. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Students, parents, and community members were already gathering at the community center. "Ready?" her father asked, carrying boxes of documents to the car. Zara touched her hair, still natural, still beautiful, still her. "Ready," she replied, but she couldn't help wondering, how would Principal Whitmore react when her past finally caught up with her? How many lives had been affected by one person's prejudice? The drive to the community center was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, where people were already lined up to enter the meeting. Signs and banners waved in the evening breeze. "Whatever happens tonight," her mother said, parking the car, "remember, you didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for everyone who couldn't." Zara nodded, watching more people arrive. The truth about Principal Whitmore was finally coming to light, and nothing would ever be the same at Riverside High again. The community center's main hall had never been so packed. People stood along the walls, sat in the aisles, and spilled out into the hallway. The air conditioning struggled to keep up with the crowd, and volunteers passed out paper cups of water. Local news cameras were set up in the back, their red lights blinking steadily. Principal Whitmore sat at the front table, looking perfectly composed in her gray suit, but Zara, watching from the third row with her parents, noticed how the principal's hands kept smoothing her already smooth jacket, how her water glass trembled slightly when she lifted it to her lips. The school board chairman called the meeting to order, his gavel barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "Due to the extraordinary circumstances and public interest," he announced, "we've modified our usual format. We'll begin with public comments, followed by the presentation of evidence regarding the recent suspension incident and related matters." Principal Whitmore's lawyer leaned over to whisper something to her, but she waved him off. She'd been doing this for 20 years. She knew how to handle angry parents and temporary controversies. Her face held that same stern confidence Zara had seen in her office just days ago. That confidence began to crack during the public comments. One by one, former students and parents approached the microphone. A young woman, now in medical school, described how she'd nearly quit high school after repeated dress code violations for her braids. A father spoke about his daughter's anxiety attacks after being humiliated in front of her class. Current students shared their own stories of being singled out, made to feel different, less than. Principal Whitmore's expression remained neutral, but her fingers drummed increasingly faster on the table. Her lawyer kept trying to pass her notes, which she ignored. Then came the evidence. Zara's father presented his findings first, laying out the pattern across multiple school districts. Charts and graphs showed the spike in suspension rates wherever Principal Whitmore took charge. Copies of dress code policies revealed subtle changes in language after her arrival, always adding vague terms like appropriate and professional that could be selectively enforced. "Ms. Whitmore," the board chairman asked, "would you like to respond to these allegations?" She stood, smoothing her jacket one more time. "These statistics are being manipulated to tell a false story," she began, her voice carrying that familiar note of authority. "Every disciplinary action was justified by school policy. We have standards to maintain." "What standards?" The question came from Mrs. Washington, who had been waiting for her turn to speak. She approached the microphone, carrying her briefcase of documents. "I watched you target student after student. I kept records." She began projecting photos onto the large screen. students before and after Principal Whitmore's arrival, showing the dramatic change in how they presented themselves. "These are all excellent students," Mrs. Washington continued. "On a roll, student council, sports teams. The only thing they did wrong was not fitting your personal idea of what a student should look like." Principal Whitmore's composure cracked. Those students were challenging authority by existing. Someone called from the crowd by being themselves. The principal's face flushed red. Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, but she pulled away. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "These children need to learn how the real world works. They need to understand that they're—" "Please continue, Ms. Whitmore," the board chairman said quietly. "What exactly do you mean by their place?" The silence stretched out. Principal Whitmore's lawyer was practically trying to pull her back into her seat, but she stood frozen, her mask of professional authority completely shattered. I simply meant," she stammered, but there was no recovering from this moment. 20 years of careful language and hidden biases had just been exposed in one emotional outburst. Zara watched from her seat, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of her felt sorry for this woman who had spent decades fighting against change, holding onto outdated prejudices. But a larger part of her felt relief that finally everyone could see what had been happening all along. The chairman cleared his throat. "I think we've heard enough. The board will take a brief recess to consider all the evidence presented. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. As Principal Whitmore sank back into her chair, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her, the crowd began to buzz with conversation. Phones lit up across the room as people shared what they'd just witnessed. Within minutes, clips of the principal's outburst were already spreading across social media. "You okay?" Nisha whispered, squeezing Zara's hand. Zara nodded, touching her hair gently. "Yeah. I just never expected." She paused, watching Principal Whitmore huddle with her lawyer, their whispered argument clearly visible even from a distance. "I never expected her to just break like that." "Sometimes," her father said softly, "people carry their prejudices for so long they forget that even prejudices. They start believing they're just the way things are." The next 30 minutes would change everything at Riverside High. But for now, Zara sat with her family and friends, feeling the weight of history shifting around them. Change wasn't always comfortable, but sometimes it was necessary and long overdue. The next morning's headlines told the story in bold letters. Principal placed on administrative leave following controversial board meeting. But that was just the beginning of the changes coming to Riverside High. Zara sat in her family's living room, surrounded by stacks of newspapers. Her father's article had been picked up by national media outlets, and her phone kept buzzing with interview requests. The story had struck a chord far beyond their small community. "Look at this," her mother said, showing her a message from the superintendent's office. The school board had worked through the night, drafting new policies and guidelines. Principal Whitmore's suspension of Zara had been immediately expunged from her record. "But that's not enough," Zara said quietly. "What about all the other students, the ones who came before me?" Her mother smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "Keep reading." The board had announced a complete review of all disciplinary actions under Principal Whitmore's leadership. A special committee would be formed to examine past cases and make recommendations for addressing any injustices found. But the most significant change was yet to come. The doorbell rang. It was Dr. Rivera, a well-known diversity and inclusion consultant who had been watching the story unfold. The school board had hired her firm to help reshape Riverside High's policies from the ground up. "We're not just changing rules on paper," Dr. Rivera explained, spreading documents across the coffee table. "We're changing the culture, and we want student input every step of the way." The living room became a temporary command center as more people arrived. Mrs. Washington brought years of documentation that would help identify students who had been unfairly targeted. Community leaders offered resources and support. Even some school board members stopped by, eager to be part of the solution. "Check this out," Nisha said, showing Zara her phone. Students across the district were sharing photos of themselves with their natural hair, cultural dress, and traditional styles. The hashtag Riverside Rising was trending locally. The work wasn't easy. Some people resisted change, clinging to old ways of thinking. But for every voice of opposition, there were dozens more supporting the transformation. Late that afternoon, Zora's father received an email that made him pause. "It's from a teacher at Principal Whitmore's first school," he said. "She wants to apologize for staying silent all those years ago. Says watching what happened here gave her the courage to finally speak up." Similar messages kept coming in. Former administrators who had witnessed discrimination but felt powerless to stop it. Teachers who had tried to protect their students but faced retaliation. Parents who had moved their children to different schools rather than fight a system that seemed too big to change. "You know what this reminds me of?" Mrs. Washington said, looking through old yearbooks they were using to identify affected students. "It's like when they integrated the schools. People said that was too big to change too, but it just took brave people willing to stand up." The school board worked late into the evening, drafting what would become known as the Comprehensive Cultural Inclusion Policy. It went far beyond just hair, addressing dress codes, cultural expression, religious accommodations, and more. "We're not just fixing what's broken," one board member explained. "We're building something new, something better." Around dinner time, a group of students arrived with takeout food for everyone. They had been brainstorming ideas for a student advisory council that would help implement the new policies. "We want to make sure this never happens again," said one student, spreading out their proposal. "Not just here, but anywhere." Zora watched as students who had once felt marginalized now took the lead in reshaping their school. The same determination she had felt walking into school with her natural hair was now reflected in dozens of faces, all working toward change. Her mother received a call from the state education department. Other districts were asking about Riverside's new policies, wanting to implement similar changes. What had started with one student's stand was spreading, creating ripples of change throughout the education system. "You started a revolution with your hair," Nisha joked, but there was truth in her words. As evening fell, Zora took a moment to step outside. The summer air was warm, and fireflies were just beginning to appear. Through the living room window, she could see people still working, students, teachers, parents, and administrators all focused on building something new. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a student from another state. "Saw your story. Standing up to my school's dress code tomorrow. Any advice?" Zora smiled, typing back. "Be proud of who you are. And remember, you're not alone anymore." Inside, the work continued. The old rules were being rewritten, not just about hair, but about dignity, respect, and the right to be oneself. Principal Whitmore's era was ending, but something much more important was just beginning. "Tomorrow," Dr. Rivera announced, "we start training the staff. Next week, we implement the new policies. By the time school starts again, Riverside High will be a different place." Zora looked around the room at all the people working to make that happen, people who had been strangers just days ago, now united in purpose. This wasn't just about changing rules or removing one principle. This was about changing hearts and minds, about creating a world where no student would have to choose between their identity and their education. "Ready for what comes next?" her mother asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Zora touched her hair, thinking about how a simple act of being herself had sparked such massive change. "Yeah," she said. "I think we all are." 6 months had passed since that fateful school board meeting, and Riverside High looked different in more ways than one. The morning sun sparkled off new banners hanging in the hallways, celebrating diversity with messages like, "Be proudly you," and "All cultures welcome here." But the real changes went much deeper than decorations. Zora walked through the front doors, her natural hair styled in a beautiful twist out. Around her, students chatted and laughed, wearing everything from traditional African head wraps to hijabs, from box braids to natural curls. No one gave them a second glance. It had become the new normal. "Morning, Ms. Lee." Zora called out to their new principal, who stood greeting students at the entrance. Principal Lee, known for her progressive leadership style and commitment to cultural sensitivity, had been carefully chosen after an extensive search and community input. "Good morning, Madam President," Ms. Lee replied with a warm smile, referring to Zora's new role as head of the Student Diversity Council. The council office, once a forgotten storage room, was now a bustling hub of activity. Students gathered there before classes, planning events and discussing new initiatives. Today, they were finalizing details for next week's cultural heritage celebration. The elementary schools want to participate too, Nisha announced, showing Zara the emails they'd received. What had started at Riverside High was spreading throughout the district. The morning announcements crackled over the speaker system, now delivered in multiple languages to reflect their diverse student body. A reminder about the upcoming cultural sensitivity workshop was followed by news about the success of their latest mentorship program, where older students helped newcomers navigate school life while embracing their identity. During lunch, Zara sat with her council members in the cafeteria, which now featured foods from various cultures on its menu. They were reviewing the latest draft of their Student Rights Handbook, a document that would be shared with other schools as a model for inclusive policies. "Remember this spot?" Nisha asked, pointing to their table. "This is where we used to hide during lunch, trying not to draw attention to ourselves." Zara nodded, remembering those days. Now, their table was the heart of the cafeteria, where students from all backgrounds came together to share stories and ideas. After school, Zara headed to the library for a special meeting. The local news team had returned, not for another controversy, but to document Riverside High's transformation for a special report on positive changes in education. "Can you tell us about the biggest changes you've seen?" the reporter asked, setting up for the interview. Zara thought for a moment. "The obvious changes are in the rules and policies," she began. "But the real change is in how people feel when they walk through these doors. Nobody has to hide who they are anymore." The camera crew filmed as students worked on various projects, the art club creating murals celebrating different cultures, the debate team preparing for a competition about educational equity, the journalism class writing stories about student experiences. Later, in Ms. Lee's office, Zara reviewed the latest statistics. Suspension rates had dropped dramatically. Attendance was up. Student participation in extracurricular activities had increased across all demographic groups. But the number that made her proudest was zero. The number of dress code violations related to cultural expression in the past 6 months. "Your case study is being used in education classes now," Ms. Lee mentioned, showing Zara a college textbook. "Future teachers are learning from what happened here." As for Principal Whitmore, she had quietly retired from education. Her lawyer had negotiated her departure, but the terms required her to undergo extensive cultural sensitivity training. Some said she was writing a book about her experiences and the lessons she'd learned, though nobody knew for sure. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as Zara walked to her last meeting of the day. The guidance office was holding a special session for students interested in teaching careers. The room was packed. "I want to be the kind of teacher who makes everyone feel welcome," one student was saying. "Like how Riverside is now." On her way out, Zara passed the school's trophy case. Among the sports trophies and academic awards, there was a new addition, a framed copy of the dress code policy that had started it all, alongside the new inclusive guidelines that replaced it. It served as a reminder of how far they'd come. Outside, parents were picking up their children. A mother adjusting her daughter's hijab chatted easily with another mom helping her son put his dreadlocks into a sports band for basketball practice. These simple interactions, once rare, were now everyday occurrences. "Hey," called a voice. It was Mrs. Washington, now retired but still a regular visitor to the school. "Ready for tomorrow's workshop?" They had started a program where former students shared their stories with current ones, ensuring that the lessons of the past wouldn't be forgotten. Tomorrow's session would focus on the power of standing up for what's right. As Zara walked home, she passed the local middle school, where students were leaving for the day. A young girl with natural hair, similar to how Zara's had been that first day, caught her eye and smiled shyly. "Your hair is beautiful," Zara told her. "I know," the girl replied confidently, no hint of doubt in her voice. That simple exchange, more than anything else, showed how much had changed. The next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles. They would start from a place of pride, not fear. At home, Zara found an email from a student in another state. Their school had just adopted policies similar to Riverside's, inspired by what had happened here. The change was spreading, one school at a time. "Good day?" her mother asked as Zara settled in to do her homework. Zara touched her hair, thinking about that first morning 6 months ago when she'd walked into school, nervous but determined. Yeah, she smiled. Every day is a good day when you can be yourself.